Let me say that as we have a class on the spirituality of the second half of life, it's been real fun and awkward all at the same time trying to present what we're doing in this class. So people say, well, how do I know if I'm in the second half of life? And I'm like, well, I don't know. It's kind of like where God has you in life. And so for some of us, it's facilitated by midlife, and for some people that comes way early in life. For some people that comes way later in life. Sometimes the second half of life is initiated by divorce or death or by retirement or lots of different things. And so there's no magic window that on the third Wednesday of the fourth month of your 50th year, you're finally in the second half of life, right? And so we're all at a different journey with the Lord. So some of you are not only in the second half of life, you're thriving. And it's been a very beautiful season in your own life. Some of you are maybe inching into it and you've got questions, and so whatever brought you here tonight, I'm excited. But let me just say this. When I teach spiritual direction, I always make this analogy right here. So this chair right here is for the parishioner, and this chair right here is for the spiritual director. Okay, so this is the spiritual director, this is the directee, this is the parishioner. There's a conversation that's going to unfold between the spiritual director and the parishioner. However, every good spiritual director knows that this is not the most important conversation. Every good spiritual director is going to presume that there's been a conversation happening here between the parishioner, the directee, and God. And the only thing that a good director does is ask questions to the parishioner that supports the conversation. Every good spiritual director presumes that this is the central conversation. And what happens here simply supports this conversation. In fact, every good spiritual director probably talks less and less than most people think, and maybe just asks a couple good questions. So it's my hope that I can sit here and I'm going to presume that this conversation has been happening between you and God your entire life. In the first half, as well as the second half of your life. I am not an expert in the second half of life, but I am open to the Lord putting on my heart some things that Father Rollheiser has put on paper, so that I can simply present to you some questions that might help you here. So over the next 7 weeks together, it's my hope that this is the real conversation that's happening. And that what we do here when we gather on these evenings, or if you come in the morning, is just supporting this conversation right here, because that's the most important one that we could ever be engaged in. Okay, let's take a look at number one. Obviously, we've entitled this class, The Spirituality of the Second Half of Life. So there's two natural questions for us. The first would be, what is spirituality? And secondly, what is this thing called the second half of life? Number two, spirituality is the quality of a person who seeks to encounter God, have a relationship with God, and live in according to God's will within the circumstances of His providence and the circumstances of one's life. A couple things I want to unpack there that I think are important for us. The first is that spirituality, regardless of perhaps the way that it's often talked about today, spirituality is about you and another person. It's not about getting in touch with our inner peace. It's not about mere relaxation. Spirituality, by the nature of the word, requires another person to be involved, that person being God. And God has always been involved in our life. God has always been reaching out to us. The Catechism defines that in the fourth section of the Catechism as it defines prayer. It says that man may forget God, he may hide far from His face, he may run after idols or accuse God of having abandoned Him, but the living and true God tirelessly calls each person to that mysterious encounter known as prayer. And it goes on and says, in prayer, God's initiative always comes first, our own first step is always a response. So God's always with us. In fact, what might even be more helpful for us tonight is that if this is the present moment, God always lives here. Now, what can be very difficult for all of us, regardless of where you find yourself in life, is have we befriended where we are in life? Because if we're not present to the present moment, if we're trying to be somewhere other than where we are, if we're trying to be someone other than who we are, then we can look for God, we can struggle with God, and we can wonder where God is. And a lot of times, God is actually where we're supposed to be. And He's waiting for us there. So what I love about the definition of spirituality, which comes from the Catholic Encyclopedia, it's a basic definition, it says that we encounter God where? In the circumstances of one's life. So, why would we want to be here tonight? Well, because the circumstances of life change with life. You know that. You've lived enough to know that what life felt like when you were younger and maybe raising your kids or trying to figure out how to be married or just trying to prove to the world who you were. And that feels very different today for those of us who are in the second half of life. God has not changed, but the circumstances of life have. And that means that the conversation with God, which is always about the present moment, often does change. And as we'll see at the end of our conversation tonight, if I'm unwilling or unable to know what God might we want to talk about, then it can be very difficult for me to hear God with me in the midst of that. So if there are two halves of life, what we want to do is we want to tonight just acknowledge some of the things that were in the first half, because some of us might still be either engaged with things or thinking about things or maybe struggling with things in the first half of life. And if we just understand what's there and why it's there, it can be helpful for us, but can also help us as in the second half of life, as we'll see in the next 6 weeks, look back on knowing some of the geography there, right? So what's one easy image for us to understand the journey of life? This comes from Job, number 4, right? Job arose and tore his cloak and cut off his hair. He fell to the ground and worshipped, and he said, "Naked I came forth from my mother's womb, and naked I shall go back." That's life. Let me unpack that with you as we go there. We are born naked. And in the moment of birth, there's presumably utter peace inside a child. The child is at utter peace with who he or she is. The child, presumably with its mother, or in the early days, is at utter peace with where they are in life. They're not trying to be anywhere else or anybody else. Biologically and with all of its existence, that child is naked, and it's okay with being naked. It doesn't need anything else. Now you need to catch the metaphor here. Catch the analogy, catch the image. Then we start putting clothes in that baby. And those clothes change over time. Those clothes begin to define how people look at that person. That person over time chooses these types of clothes or that type of clothes, and we clothe ourselves all throughout life. And on the back half of life, in the end, to use a reverential but a sobering image, we're naked one more time. We're naked once again as we go to the Lord. Now imagine if that second moment of being naked were as peaceful and as centered and as existentially aligned with life as the first being was. Being naked the first time and being peace at that moment of life, that's not hard. But being at peace and rest and freedom that second time when we're naked, well, that's the journey of the second half of life. That's the journey of life as a whole. but that's where we're going. We're all in that journey together. So let's take a couple look at a couple things in number 5. Let's go ahead and look at some of the things that are a part of the first half of life and some of the things that are in the second part of life. Now, I want to remind us all that some of this may describe where you are. You might feel some things on both sides of the columns. That's okay, because we're all at different spaces in life. Somebody asked me this morning, well, they said, well, is the second half of life better than the first half? I said, well, it depends on how the first half of life was for you. And it depends on how you're doing in the second half. I said, they're not right or wrong. They are. And the image just said, was it better when I had hair on top of my head? I said, no, I didn't do anything to make it fall out. It just fell out. And I'm as content with it as I am without it. And I'm as discontent with it as I am with that. It is what it is. It's not better or worse, right? So when you're looking at the two columns here, you don't have to jockey for one side or the other, right? The other thing is it's like grief. There are 4 stages to grief, right? So whenever you're grieving, could be death, it could be a loss of anything, right? 4 stages to grief. There's denial, anger, depression, and acceptance. And it's not like what happens is you don't calendar that stuff, right? You don't say, okay, I've just lost my father or my mother or my spouse or my child or my loved one, and you say, okay, I'm going to be angry for the next 4 months and 17 days, and then on the 18th day, I'll wake up and I'll be better. No, it doesn't work like that. The natural progression of grief happens is you go from anger into acceptance, and then you go back to denial. And you go back into anger, and you taste a little freedom. You move in and out. And the same thing is with some of these categories here as life progresses. Okay, so let's take a look at it. The first is, in both stages of life, you and I are going to ask questions about our identity. We're going to ask them differently, whether we have a masculine heart or a feminine heart. But the search for who we are is just a part of life. In the first half of life, we seek to prove who we are. And in the second half of life, we actually discover who we are. I shared this at the 4 and 7 this weekend a little bit, right? So I'm the 5th of 6 kids. And in my family, the way you got Dad's attention was you got it right. And the way you got Dad's attention was you were a leader, right? So 6 kids, 4 student council presidents, a key club president, and a student council vice president. We were all leaders in high school. In fact, I remember getting to Terrebonne High School, and the 2 things that I heard was, you must know Laura Tabor. And I said, absolutely, I know Laura Tabor. But the second thing I heard, she's back there. The thing I heard when I got to Terrebonne for the first time is, well, you must be one of those Toops kids. And I internalized that, right? It wasn't something that was actually a welcoming statement, right? There was a lot of pressure in that. And in the first half of life, we all try to prove ourselves in some way. Some of us, it might be through financial success. For some of us, it might be through your family, through the quality of your kids and how well they're doing. It could be living into the expectations of your mother and father. In the first half of life, you can struggle meeting the expectations of your spouse. We can try to prove who we are, right? Marriage is hard, and a lot of people carry the burden of being in the wrong marriage for way too long, and you try to prove to the world that I'm going to make this one work, right? Lots of different ways that we seek to prove who we are. Let's say you have a guy out there, and he was the high school quarterback. He was the big athlete. He was homecoming king at E.D. White. He was the man. Well, when he's 60 years old, his body's not going to move the same way it did when he was 16. And if his whole life he's defined himself as the athlete, at some point in the second half of life, he's going to come face to face with the label that he placed on himself never really was who he was to begin with. Let's say you have a woman, Eve. And Eve has always been beautiful. And Eve, as she gets older, is aging gracefully, but as she's, 50 or 60 or 70, her body physically doesn't look like it did when she was 17. And maybe when she was younger and she would go to the grocery store, guys would give a second or a third look, and now she goes to the grocery store and people just look at the Cheerios, right? Right? And she is caught up in the label of, I am beautiful. Well, then she's going to come face to face when the lights are out and she's trying to go to sleep, right? Well, am I no longer beautiful? In the first half of life, people put labels on us before we put labels on us. In the first half of life, a lot of people try to live into those labels. And at some point, those labels are just going to fall apart. The first half of life, you may define yourself by your profession. First half of life, you may define yourself by your kids. Oh, aren't you so-and-so's mama? Well, and then your kids move out. And you're no longer so-and-so's mama, right? Okay, so our identity, and we're going to spend a lot of time in the back end of this on page 3 talking about this tonight, is defined in different ways. Second thing, first half of life, we're all looking for purpose and meaning in life. We're all looking for a calling. That's just innate. That's just who we are. The first half of life, that's often connected to, not always, but often connected to our vocation, our profession, or our provision. So what's your purpose in the first half of life? I'm going to get married, maybe. I'm going to raise these kids, and I'm pushing, and everything I have is in these kids. First half of life, I'm providing, right? I'm building the nest egg. I'm building up the retirement. I'm trying to provide for the kids, right? The first half of life, our purpose is directed in that way. The second half of life, our purpose is different. What do you do when the nest egg is already built and you don't have to build anymore? Or what do you do when the house is empty and you have empty nest? And you know, so in the second half of life, you have to find your purpose because it can't be defined in the same way it was in the first half of life, right? So Father Rolheiser says, he says, it's in people, the relationships we form, passion and permission. I remember talking to my dad. I think my dad worked 7 years after he could have retired because I really don't think my dad knew what life looked like outside the waterworks. I don't think he knew what it was going to be after retirement. And I remember distinctly one day we were having a conversation and we were talking about if he retires and what is he going to do. And he grew up at Southdown. And I remember him saying, I would love just to give back to Southdown. Okay? So his purpose was when he gave himself permission to do the things that he always wanted to do, right? It wasn't nostalgic. He was going to just make sure that Southdown Marketplace happened every year. He just gave himself permission to do the things that he wanted to do. Number 3, we have questions that we're going to ask ourselves in life. They're just there. In the first half of life, maybe you remember some of these questions, right? Am I going to make it? Or are we going to make it? Is our family going to make it through this? Am I going to make it through this? This is where you feel a different type of stress in life, and it's about, am I going to make it to, I don't know. Everybody's got their own image of what making it looks like, depending on your family circumstances and who you connect with later on in life. The question on the second half of life, am I needed? Now, we hear that in different ways, but I have seen both ends in my priesthood, listening to people, and those questions kind of rise up in a different way, you know. So-and-so retires, and he or she, after 2 months of doing all of the honeydews or all of the shopping, 2 months after, like, okay, what do I do with my time? And the phone's not ringing off the hook anymore, and somebody replaced him or her at work, or the kids are raising their own kids, and maybe not for all people, but for a lot of people in the second half of life, there's a very piercing question there: am I needed? What's the struggle? The first half of life, the struggle is with boundaries. The first half of life, you think you can do everything, and the struggle is to not do it all, right? That's why he says the struggle in the first half of life is with the sixth commandment, right? Thou shalt not commit adultery, right? Just because you can, you shouldn't, right? The struggle in the second half of life is with limitations, right? They both deal with I can't do, but we feel them differently depending on where we are in life. The interior tension kind of flows from that. The tension in the first half of life is fighting with the devil. Father Rollheiser tells this beautiful story of a monk who's sharing his story with Father Rollheiser and says, well, do you struggle with sin anymore? He says, no. He says, that we stopped that a long time ago. He says, the devil leaves me alone, I'll leave him alone. He says the struggle in the second half of life is with God. In the first half of life, maybe because life feels a certain way and because we're trying to draw boundaries and self-control and interior discipline and virtue, the struggle is I can't do that, right? But then when you get into the second half of life, you have lots of questions with God. Why do bad things happen to good people? Father Rollheiser talks a lot about suffering and what suffering does to us and our hearts and how that either propels us into God or that jades our heart against God. We'll talk about that a little bit this weekend at 4 and 7 as we unpack the hardness of heart that Jesus talks about in the gospel. But in the second half of life, you have lots of questions about God. Am I going to make it to heaven? You look back on the people that you love in life and you see them struggle, and it's not about the devil, it's about God. Why are you letting this happen? And then finally, the longing. The longing in the first half of life is balance and just trying to find silence. The second half of life, sometimes the longing can be, what do I do with all of the silence? It just feels different. Like the thirst for silence just feels differently depending on where you are. So I want you to take 10 seconds. You don't have to say anything. You don't have to write anything down. Just want you to look at those two columns for a second. And just ask yourself, does anything on either the left or the right kind of touch your heart with where you are right now? Or maybe with where you've been? You just want to pay attention to that so you can pray later on. What does this look like in people that we might see in the scriptures? How about two examples of feminine heart and a masculine heart? Mary Magdalene. Lots of people have helped us understand a little bit about Mary Magdalene. Certainly there are schools of biblical theology that are popular today that I find very trustworthy. People like Dr. Brett Petrie or Scott Hahn or Jeff Cavins, if you know any of those names. They would help us understand that the woman in Luke 7 who is caught in sexual sin and she is moved with contrition. She kind of gets into the house of the Pharisee and is weeping at Jesus' feet. This is the same Mary Magdalene that's at the cross with Mary, the mother of Jesus. And then, of course, Jesus reveals himself to. I don't know. I don't know. The circumstances in someone's life that would lead them into compulsive promiscuity. And I don't know the circumstances in someone's life that would propel them into the type of prostitution that would have been a part of maybe Mary Magdalene's life. I don't know the circumstances. I don't pretend to know that. What I do know is this. Male or female, my experience as a confessor is this, that when there is a sin of compulsive promiscuity that is extended over someone's early years, it's usually never about the physical contact. It's usually about a search for identity. When you're young, that's what I'm talking about. When you're younger and we look at Mary Magdalene at this stage of her life, what is Mary looking for? How does she define herself? This is a question about identity in Mary Magdalene's life. And at the end of her life, things are different. Mary no longer defines herself either by her sin or by what she was looking for in the sin. And interestingly enough, through that lens, how is it that Jesus reveals that he's risen? He says her name. Mary. I'm going to tell you who you are. In the first half of life, Mary Magdalene is searching for something. I think she's searching for herself. In the second half of life, God's going to tell her who she is. Second person in the scripture is Moses. Moses struggles with the devil in the first half of life, right? He's got all this fire inside of him. Moses is somebody, right? He's of the Egyptian household. He's not just somebody who was born in a river. He grew up in that house. He is somebody. And in the first half of life, you're trying to struggle with boundaries and keep it all contained, and he doesn't. He murders a man. His battle is with the enemy in the first part of his life. In the second part of life, Moses is no longer struggling with the devil. If you look at the second bullet on number 7 at the top of page 3, this is from Numbers chapter 20. This is at the end of the journey. We are looking at the promised land. And Moses is asked to trust God. Just tap the rock. I know you guys are thirsty. And he doesn't trust God. You ever wonder why Moses didn't make it to the promised land? Right here. This is the passage. It says in this passage, God says, because you didn't trust me, you're not going to walk into the land that I promised to your forefathers. So Moses struggles with the enemy the first half of life, struggles in trusting God in the second half of life. Now, the struggle is, I think, centered around identity. And I want to encapsulate for you the struggle of the first half of life in the following image. We live in a culture, on number 8 here, where it's so all around us, we can't get away from it. That what comes first, just to use some words here tonight, is our mission, which informs our identity, and that informs our relationship. So there's a paradigm, I've learned this from the Institute for Priestly Formation, that in our culture that we grew up in, the first half of life, it's mission, identity, relationship. Now, mission is really just what you see to be your purpose. Let's take a look at a couple things around that. Okay, if our purpose in life is first, that could be your vocation or your profession. It could be being a married man or woman. It could be your professional or your business life. But if that's who we are, then look at B. If we're successful, that has implications in our life. And if there's failure or sin, that has implications in our life. So for men, I think we feel it in certain ways, and I think women feel it in certain ways. John Eldredge says this. He says, men search for their identity through the 3 B's. The ball field, the bedroom, and the boardroom. When you're a little kid, when you're 7 years old, when you're 8 years old, you got a little boy, maybe your grandkids or your kids. Okay, after you are out the equation, after mom and dad are out the equation, after the teachers are out the equation, when you're 7 years old, one of the most influential things in your life is recess. And are you measuring up to the other boys? How is it that little boys prove that they're little boys in South Louisiana? You play football. You go hunting. You play soccer. You fight with each other, right? A man in our culture, because of what's here, when you're a kid, we try to prove that we are somebody athletically. That happens and lasts till about puberty. And then, because of the culture that we live in, many men, not all of them, many men seek to prove who they are with women in the bedroom. And that lasts for a certain time. Maybe it ends, maybe it doesn't. And then many men, maybe not you, but most men, spend the rest of their life trying to prove who they are through finances. The size of the house, the size of the boat, the this or the that. In the first half of life, men try to prove who they are through those 3 B's. Now, women might feel it, might experience it in a different way. I'm going to use the 3 P's here. I know experientially what it's like for a man. I'm only listening to the feminine heart and seeing this. But the 3 P's for the woman are perfection, pursued, and protected. Now, if it wasn't your favorite story, that's okay. Just indulge me for a second. But I think every little girl's favorite story is Rapunzel. Now, maybe yours wasn't. Maybe yours favorite story was the greatest hits of LSU football. I don't know what it was, right? Or greatest hits of Nichols football or whatever it was, right? But there's something almost anthropological about Rapunzel for a little girl. Why? Because every girl wants to be in the tower, beautiful. And every little girl wants to be the one in the tower who's being pursued by the knight in shining armor. And every little girl wants to be protected the rest of her life by that strong knight in shining armor. Now, maybe that wasn't for you, but that's for a lot of women. We live in a culture where there is an inordinate amount of emphasis on beauty. And the way that little girls internalize that depends on how they are either acknowledged to be beautiful or perceive themselves to be beautiful. And a lot of what is in the pursuit of life is wanting to be pursued and the feeling of wanting to be protected. Okay, so that's just there in a man's life and that's there in a woman's life, right? But I just want you to notice that this has an influence in life in this paradigm. Those things inform the way that I see myself to be, right? So if mission is first, then identity, look at letter A. So now my childhood, my life, my family, my vocation, my money, my checkbook, my all that, they influence how I perceive myself to be. So as we're in the first half of life and we're trying to prove who we are to the world and prove who we are to ourselves, right? If we're looking for that from our mission or from the performance-based things or the external things, then, well, when things are good, we feel good about ourselves. But when your past catches up with you, when somebody else's past catches up with you, when sin catches up with you, when mistakes or failures, then when the lights go out and you're trying to fall asleep, what are the voices that you hear about your identity? See, it claims our identity. We no longer are a sinner, we are the sin. We are no longer someone who's made a mistake, we are the mistake in the first half of life. So then what happens is we now project that onto God, and our relationship with God is now significantly determined by how we perceive ourselves to be. So, hey, things are going great in your life and you feel really good about who you are, and you go before the Lord, you presume that God feels the same way about you, and maybe things are easy in your relationship with God. But if our mission's first and our identity is second, then what happens when you don't feel good about yourself? What happens when the tapes that go through your head are going through your head? See, in the first half of life, we project that onto God. And I'm convinced that a lot of people who struggle with the Lord in the first half of life are more struggling with themselves and allowing themselves to be found by God in that journey than anything else. Now, at some point in the journey of life, there's got to be a shift. We grew up with mission, identity, relationship. And the wisdom in life is flipping that. Number one, our relationship with God precedes everything else. There is only one man on the planet that biologically I can claim to be my father. In fact, there is nothing on this earth, morally or financially or legally, I can do to change the biological reality that Prosper Toops Jr. is my father. And I will forever be his son. And there is nothing morally, legally, that can change that relationship. Well, the same is true with God. We are always his son and his daughter. That is always the primary relationship in our life. In fact, one of the things I do in marriage prep is, it's one of the first things I do in marriage prep. I have him look at her and her look at him, and they both say the same things to each other. And they say, repeat after me, I, blah, blah, blah. I cannot complete you. No spouse is ontologically able to complete the other spouse. Now, it can be really good, all right? Now, and it can be really bad, right? All right. But ontologically, in your existence, no other human being can complete you, because you have a supernatural soul that cannot be completed by any natural element. When we go to heaven, we will all be ultimately completed by God. So God's the only one who can complete me. Now, he gives us a spouse to dispose us to that, to help us taste that, right? That's the beauty of marriage when it's beautiful. But my relationship with God is always first and foremost in my life. Look at the next line. When I know whose I am, I know who I am. If my relationship with God is first, then that and that alone determines who I am. Now, I can be successful in lots of different ways. My kids can be successful in lots of the labels that I used to grasp at can still be true, but none of those things determine who we are. I remember I was ordained in 2001, and the average age of the priesthood was a lot older than it is now. And I remember the year after I got ordained, Father Josh got ordained. And we were at some place together, and we looked at each other, and we said something about being the young priests. Because we knew that because we were getting all the weddings, right? And that lasted for a long time. We were getting all the weddings. Kathy can tell you that, right? And I was at Father Andre Malonzo's ordination. I was sitting in the sanctuary, and it dawned on me that I was no longer the young priest. And I remember distinctly that there had been a long time where I would always give the Friday night talk at Tech. It's a youth retreat. And I remember having it on my calendar from the previous year. And I remember I didn't get asked to make the talk. They asked Father Andre to give the talk. And I remember struggling with it because I was going to go just to check it out, right? And I didn't go. But I remember realizing I'm no longer the young priest, right? The labels that we carry in life are always going to fade away. But my relationship with God, my identity in God, never leaves me. Then what happens, mission, if my relationship is first, and from that alone, I claim my identity, then my mission, my profession, my family, my purpose in life, on the front half or the second half, can change because I'm no longer doing anything for God. I'm doing everything with God. Amen? So if my dad is a super successful chief engineer for waterworks, that's great. And if he's cutting grass at Southdown, that's great. Because he's with God in both places. Now, look at the top of page 4, number 10. How do you know you're in one or the other, and how do you know you're being called from one to the other? Number 10, Every beginning begins when something ending ends. Let me say that again because that could have been a little tongue twister for you right there. And every beginning begins when something ending ends. Every new beginning in life is on the heels of something ending. To the degree that I can make friends with this ending significantly determines whether or not I'm free to embrace what's ahead of me. What are some of the things that can usher that for us? Midlife. We all feel that in different ways. How about empty nest? You may have had your own image of what life was going to look like. Or maybe the nest isn't empty and you're trying to empty it, right? And you're like, okay, y'all can fly away and get out of the house, right? Right? Okay. So, all right, so it can happen in different ways, all right? Divorce. Your finances can tank. Retirement. Cancer. Any significant surgery. Any significant health issue. The death of maybe your parents or your siblings, or may I say this reverently, even a spouse or even a child. Okay, all of those things, there's a new chapter in front of you. Now here's the thing. Life will not ask your permission. Okay? It's not going to put it on your calendar and give you a chance to get ready for it. Life is not fair. Bad things happen to good people. And it's going to be a point in our lives. This is where Rolheiser begins to talk about the school of suffering. When these things happen, it is difficult, and you know this more than I do. It is difficult to befriend that ending. You lost your job, or you lost a person, or your body doesn't do what it used to do, or you don't have the freedom financially to do what you used to do, whatever it is, right? Okay, every new beginning is only beginning because something's ending. Now, God's always in the present moment. And God is walking with us into the future. To the degree that I am free to let this end, I can move with God into the future. Not any of us, but maybe you know some people who are still trying to live here when life is moving them here. Or whatever this ending was, it was painful. There was a lot of suffering in it. It didn't ask their permission. They don't want to move to the next season because nobody asked them if the old season was supposed to end, right? To the degree that we are free to walk forward depends on, have I befriended what was ending? Number 11. I have to know where I am to find God with me there. Freedom is not being able to do whatever it is that I want to do. Freedom is knowing where I am and where I am not, and knowing the difference between the two. It's about being present to the present moment and not expecting that I am to be where I am not. Life is life. I came into the world naked, and I don't know anybody who's beat it yet, who's not going to return. We can't stop life. Freedom is knowing where I am in the limitations or in the boundaries. Freedom is, knowing where I am in either grabbing for the labels or trying to discover who I really am. Freedom is knowing where I am. I'm still fighting with the enemy or I'm fighting with God. Okay, there's no, one place is not better than the other. Freedom is just I embrace the season in life that I'm in. So something like what we're doing actually enables us, it empowers us to at least, even if we can't make friends with where we are, we can at least acknowledge where I can no longer be. Right? I may not like where I am, but sometimes that just requires that I befriend with, okay, I'm no longer there. Or freedom is, I'm no longer there. Praise God. And there can be some fear of, well, what's ahead of me, right? So there can be the lack of freedom on either end of it.